All right, let's jump right into this. When we hear the phrase mass migration, the very first thing that pops into our heads is usually a humanitarian picture, right? People seeking safety, crossing borders, just looking for a better life. But what if we looked at this through a totally different lens? Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to break down a pretty fascinating and honestly highly complex source text called Weaponized Migration and the Geopolitical Siege of the West. Now, according to the counterintelligence circles cited in our source, mass migration has actually evolved into something way more calculated. We're looking at migration not just as this organic movement of people, but literally as a deliberate, operational tool of asymmetric warfare. It is a super provocative framework, and we're going to unpack exactly how this text claims this geopolitical siege actually plays out. So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll define weaponized migration, then we'll break down the strategy of attrition, explore some real-world frontlines, examine the current Western policy pivot, and finally wrap up with the text's civilizational conclusion. Let's get to it. All right, Section 1, Defining Weaponized Migration, Beyond the Surface. To really grasp this text, we've got to look a little deeper. The source basically asks us to just set aside our standard sociological definitions for a minute and look at the raw realpolitik here. It defines weaponized migration super precisely. It calls it the deliberate orchestration, facilitation, or manipulation of large-scale population movements by foreign adversaries. And the goal? Well, it's highly specific. It's to compromise the national security, fiscal health, and social stability of a target nation. So this isn't actually about the migrants themselves. Instead, according to the source, it's about hostile foreign states and transnational syndicates intentionally exploiting open borders as a tactical maneuver. You can really see the stark contrast here. On one side, you have the traditional humanitarian view, organic movement driven by people looking for safety and opportunity. But then on the other side is this asymmetric warfare view outlined in our text. From this angle, adversaries are actively engineering these flows to cause domestic instability in Western democracies. It's a massive shift. It goes from viewing border crises as these tragic accidents of geography to viewing them as orchestrated events literally designed to weaken a nation without ever firing a single conventional weapon. Moving on to Section 2, the strategy of attrition, or as the text calls it, engineering overload. So the goal here isn't to conquer physical territory. Instead, it's to engineer what they call structural overload. Just think about the infrastructure in your own city for a second. When millions of people are rapidly funneled across a border outside of the normal legal pipelines, the text argues that it triggers this immediate structural shock. Municipal budgets get completely paralyzed, public housing gets overwhelmed, local healthcare is pushed right to the brink, and the legal infrastructure, well, it gets totally jammed up. The source asserts that this creates a massive diversion of a country's capital. Money gets pulled away from long-term national development and defense and turns into a giant emergency crisis response fund. Now, the source introduces this absolutely fascinating concept that it calls the liberal paradox. According to the text, hostile actors specifically weaponize a host nation's own values right against it. They know full well that Western nations are deeply committed to international human rights, due process, and asylum frameworks. So the moment a migrant steps onto Western soil, the target country's own judicial system legally obligates it to provide processing and housing. The text argues that adversaries use this very commitment as an operational chokehold. It essentially paralyzes the host nation's ability to defend its borders because it's completely tied up in its own legal processes. But, the damage isn't just physical or financial. The source outlines a whole second layer to this attrition, which is cognitive warfare. Mass, unmanaged migration is intentionally used to stoke deep political polarization. Dropping undocumented populations into local economies sparks intense domestic friction, which, according to the text, paralyzes the target nation's legislative capacity. And on top of that, when citizens see their tax dollars and public spaces overwhelmed while their public services decline, public confidence in state sovereignty just collapses. The ultimate goal of this gray zone warfare is internal demoralization, basically weakening the nation from the inside out. All right, let's hit Section 3, real-world geopolitical frontlines. We're going to look at the engineered crises of the past decade. The text maps out a really clear timeline of how these engineered crises have played out in reality. It points straight to the massive 2015 Mediterranean wave into Europe, the highly calculated 2021 border crisis engineered by Belarus and Russia, and at the exact same time, the massive evolution of the modern caravan era hitting North America throughout the 2010s and 2020s. Let's break these down continent by continent. So on the European front, the text actually presents Europe as a primary testing ground for this whole tactic. Starting in 2015, the exodus from the Middle East and North Africa was, according to the source, heavily accelerated by Russian military interventions in Syria and the activation of smuggling hubs in Libya. This flooded European transit corridors, forcing sudden border closures and just severely straining EU welfare budgets. And looking at the evidence here, there's a more explicit operation, the Belarusian Axis. The text asserts that the regime in Belarus, directly backed by Moscow, systematically flew migrants from places like Iraq and Syria into Minsk and literally escorted them logistically right to the borders of Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. This wasn't some accident. The source reports it was a highly calculated move to test NATO's cohesion and retaliate against Western sanctions. Over that exact same decade, a parallel situation was unfolding in North America. The text notes a major shift from small, hidden groups to these massive, organized caravans of tens of thousands of individuals coming out of Central America and Mexico. But, and this is key, the source claims these didn't just organically form. They were actively financed and coordinated by transnational cartel syndicates. These networks supposedly provided maps and transit tools specifically to maximize the volume hitting the U.S. border. Which brings us directly to the cartel's tactical objective, identified in the text as the systematic flooding protocol. Let's just walk through these steps really quick. First, you direct thousands of migrants to surrender at a single concentrated border sector, all at the same time. Second, you paralyze the local security forces, who instantly get consumed with processing paperwork and providing humanitarian care. Third, and this is the most crucial part, once those border authorities are tied down, the cartels exploit the unmonitored blind spots left behind to smuggle high-value contraband, synthetic fentanyl, and high-risk individuals straight into the interior. Section 4, the Western Policy Pivot. Let's look at how enforcement overhauls are completely changing the landscape. According to the text, the baseline approach to border security has recently undergone a massive overhaul. In the United States, for example, this means the absolute termination of the old catch-and-release policies. The new directive, it's the implementation of absolute non-release. So, undocumented individuals intercepted at the border are simply no longer granted access to the domestic interior to await their court dates. The source notes that this absolute non-release protocol, paired up with historic enforcement crackdowns, is cited as the main driver behind a transition to negative net migration, where interior spaces are actually being actively cleared out. 56%. To put that into perspective, according to the source, that is the staggering reduction in fentanyl trafficking at the southern border following these strict closures. The text argues this creates a very direct link. By rigorously enforcing the physical line, security operations have successfully starved cartel networks of their primary domestic profit loops, which fundamentally leads to the destruction of organized criminal supply lines. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, European nations are executing a parallel pivot, though the mechanics look a little bit different. While the U.S. strategy focuses super heavily on absolute non-release and domestic removals, the European Union has approved these sweeping updates centered on the externalization of processing. Basically, they are setting up return hubs located entirely outside the physical borders of the EU. The text explains that failed asylum seekers are extracted from continental soil and processed in third-country facilities. This move is designed to completely neutralize the ability of hostile actors to exploit Western domestic welfare systems. Furthermore, European border security forces, coordinated by Frontex, have officially classified mass migration as a core vector of hybrid warfare. So they're no longer treating these engineered incursions as just standard civil immigration issues. Instead, they're treating them as direct national security breaches, deploying what the text calls a unified counter-hybrid shield. This integrates military and cyber infrastructure to establish an absolutely unassailable data and physical shield across the entire Western home front. And that brings us to our final part, Section 5, the Sovereign Imperative, a civilizational conclusion. The text concludes that the era of strategic passivity is definitively over. The authors argue that for well over a decade, adversaries have mistaken Western compassion for weakness, basically attempting to use democratic safety nets as weapons. According to the source, the aggressive overhauls we just looked at show that Western civilization is actively attempting to reclaim its sovereignty. By enforcing ironclad borders and slashing criminal supply lines, the text argues these nations are asserting that freedom is absolutely not a vulnerability to be exploited. Rather, it's a hard-fought heritage that requires total clarity and resolve to defend. We're going to end today's explainer with this incredibly powerful quote, straight from the source text. The hollow structures of asymmetric subversion fracture when met with organized discipline.
It's a really compelling synthesis of their entire argument, isn't it? And it leaves us with a pretty provocative question to chew on. As the geopolitical landscape continues to evolve, how do free, open societies maintain their compassion while simultaneously projecting the organized, unyielding discipline the text says is required to survive an era of asymmetric warfare? Thank you so much for joining me today as we unpacked these concepts and explored the geopolitics of weaponized migration. Catch you next time.